case he has a problem. Thank you. So please, if you have questions, do ask them. Throw them in the chat if you would, just so that, we as you know, if you've been to our Zoom CLEs, we try to keep the distractions from open microphones to a minimum. So I'm going to get out of his way and let Dr. Gleb take it away. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Gleb.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Kim. And welcome, everyone. So, let's talk about revolutionizing legal settlements, focusing on emotional distress compensation. And the conversation will be relevant to physical distress, but we'll focus a little bit more on emotional distress, otherwise known as non-economic damages, so all of that sort of stuff. Now, I will have my slides right next to me. You should be seeing me on one square of the screen, and my slides right next to me on the other square of the screen. And it'll be below me as well. If you don't see it very clearly, what you want to do is make sure to pin me to see me in your Zoom view. Also, make sure to make your Zoom full page so that it's full screen is going to be Zoom. Okay. Now, as Kim mentioned, we'll be handling questions just by you putting them in the chat. Some of them if they're quick enough, I'll answer during the talk. Some of them I might save until the end of the talk if they're more thorough. Okay, so that's what taking care of the logistics. Okay, if you have any questions about the logistics, let me know. By the way, if you're watching this as a recording after the talk and you want to get those resources that Kim mentioned, go to the link below my name, tinyurl.com/DAE event. That's tinyurl.com/DAE event. And that'll be the slides, a copy of my book relevant to this topic, as well as the article that Kim mentioned. All right, without further ado, let's talk about what we'll be covering today. Key topics. First, we'll talk about understanding mental anguish and emotional distress, also known as non-economic damages. That's what we'll talk about first. Then, challenges in subjective evaluation of mental anguish and emotional distress. Introduction of a much more effective metric, the QALY metric, quality-adjusted life-year metric in legal evaluations. So an objective science-based metric, much more objective and science-based metric for evaluating mental anguish and emotional distress. Give some real-world examples of how these can be applied. Then strategies for how you should be presenting quality-adjusted life year in court. And finally, the benefits of using this methodology for you as lawyers. And I come from this, by the way, as a background, as an expert witness who has done a number of cases relevant to QALY and legal damages, non-economic damages. I've served both for plaintiffs, attorneys, and defense attorneys, so I know both sides of the case. In fact, right now I'm involved in two cases. One case is in Pennsylvania where someone has been, so this is a veteran, and he was locked in a steam room at a casino, due to the malfunctioning steam room, and he had PTSD, and he experienced unfortunately, a worsening of his PTSD symptoms as a result of being locked in the steam room, which was malfunctioning. And so that is where I'm helping the plaintiffs, attorneys. On the defense side, I'm working for the city of Annapolis as an expert witness, where they're being sued from an FHA perspective, Federal Housing Authority perspective, for their public housing. And they're being accused of discrimination, which is also something I talk about. But the evaluation that I'm doing for them is the non-economic damages and the discrimination. And I also have expertise in discrimination. I have another article out about that. So that's some examples of cases I'm involved in right now. And so those are the kinds of examples of cases, and there are many, many more we can talk about, where non-economic damages, mental distress, and emotional anguish are quite relevant. Let's talk about what these are. Understanding mental anguish and emotional distress. Emotional. Intense sadness. So emotions. People feel intense sadness. That's one aspect of emotional distress. Feelings of grief. So emotional sadness can be over many things. Grief is usually over major losses. Feelings of anger. That can be quite problematic. Feelings of anxiety, fear. So the person who was locked in the sauna is definitely feeling a lot more anxiety than he used to as a result of being locked in that sauna and that traumatic experience. He actually lost consciousness in that situation, knocked his head. It's a problem. But anyway, panic attacks. So panic attacks are definitely a symptom of emotional distress. There are also some cognitive symptoms of negative thoughts. So people keep thinking negative, problematic thoughts. Rumination, so cycles of the same thoughts. And difficulty concentrating, so difficulty focusing. There are also some physical components of mental anguish and emotional distress, like headaches, which often accompany mental anguish and emotional distress, muscle tension, sleep disturbances, and we know how important sleep is, fatigue, so people feel quite a bit more fatigued, GI issues are common, and hair loss is also a common symptom of mental anguish and emotional distress. So those are some symptoms of how those can be diagnosed. So when you're getting medical records, those would be things that you would find in the medical records or self-reported by the victims. Let's talk about the impact on life. Personal life can cause lots of strained relationships, up to including divorces, all sorts of problems can be caused by mental distress and emotional anguish. Social withdrawal, people withdraw from other social connections, and that's quite damaging for people. In their professional life, decreased job performance. Decreased job performance, they might forego income as a result of mental anguish and emotional distress, increased absenteeism, and other problems. Overall, for quality of life, reduced pleasure and satisfaction. Of course, that correlates with sense of depression and a risk of conditions like major depressive disorder or PTSD. And the PTSD I mentioned before was so this veteran, the person who was locked in the steam room, who had PTSD as a veteran, then he was re-traumatized in that steam room, and so his PTSD significantly worsened. Okay, those are some examples of mental distress and emotional anguish. And again, if you have any questions, pop them into the chat on part one. So any questions in part one on what emotional distress and mental anguish, those non-economic damages are, pop them into the chat. All right. Let's go on to part two. Issues with traditional subjective evaluation methods. Lack of standardization is a big one. Traditional evaluation methods lack clear standardization. It's just kind of people sort of make up stuff in a way. They just say, well, here's what I think. But there's a lack of standardization. You might have a doctor who says that or a therapist who says that. But there's a lack of standardized, clear approach about this. And that has no scientific basis. It's just what a doctor thinks or what a therapist thinks. There's no scientific basis. They won't make up stuff, but you go to basically different therapists and they'll tell you different things. There's no standardization, there's no scientific basis, and there's inconsistent criteria for assessing distress. Different doctors, different therapists, different psychiatrists will tell you different things. Not a good thing if you want to prove your case in court. So there's a variability in the tools and scales that they will use. Some therapists will use one scale, some doctors will use another scale. Again, there's a lack of consistency and there's a lack of good research behind using these scales. And so it leaves it to you as a lawyer. You're dependent on your rhetorical skills to convince the judge or the jury, the trier of the case. That's actually obviously problematic because it relies on rhetorical skills as opposed to the actual facts of the matter. And so that shows the need for more objective and reliable methods to evaluate emotional distress and mental anguish to assess non-economic damages effectively. Another problem that you'll see is variability in individual experiences. There's going to be personal differences where there's going to be different emotional responses to similar events. And so there's an influence of personal history and personal context, which will create a lot of variability, a lot of difference. And that's, again, lack of standardization. There's cultural factors where different cultures have different ways of expressing distress, different coping mechanisms and support systems. And that variability also shows the need for a more scientific, standardized approach where people are paid in a standardized, scientifically verifiable way, as opposed to, well, hey, this person comes from a certain culture, and a psychiatrist talked to them, and because they come from a certain culture, they feel more or less distressed by something, and therefore you, as a lawyer, have a situation to deal with that just based on somebody's personal narrative, essentially, and what their psychiatrist or their medical doctor thinks about their personal narrative. Now, there's going to be some errors that people typically make in evaluating these subjective evaluations. Let's talk about these errors. These are called cognitive biases. So cognitive biases is key to my expertise, part of my PhD in behavioral science, and what I've been an expert witness on for and consultant and author for many decades. So I've been since 1999. So confirmation bias is one of these cognitive biases. It's a tendency to look for information that confirms our existing preconceptions about someone and ignore conflicting evidence. As a result, there are some skewed evaluations based on initial impressions, which reinforce existing beliefs. That, of course, really opens the door for a lot of biases. For example, if you have a clinician, a doctor who's focused on symptoms that fit a diagnosis, they'll tend to overlook alternative explanations. And that might be good or bad for your specific case, but that's not standardized and that creates variance. So that's going to undermine if the whole presumption of the case, that the confirmation bias. Anchoring bias is another one. We tend to over-rely on initial information that we get about a situation and use that first impression as a fundamental reference point. So the impact is that it causes distorted assessments because of that initial data, and we have difficulty changing our evaluations as we get new data. For example, the initial symptom from a clinician, if we're using that, will report that is reported will influence the overall judgment, and clinicians will tend to fail to adequately evaluate additional evidence on the matter. That's the anchoring bias. Availability heuristic. We tend to remember what is most available in our memory, so we overestimate the importance of this memorable information and rely on the most recent memorable events. The impact is there is a bias toward dramatic cases, recent cases, and neglect of less obvious but quite relevant information. For example, a clinician can be influenced by similar recent cases and be overemphasize vivid patient stories. So again, the rhetorical skills, personal narrative, convincing judges or juries, again, might be good for some cases, might be for your personal case or might not be, but it will, whatever the patient says, but it will undermine your ability to prove the case to anyone who has any degree of skepticism. And you'll definitely, judges by definition have quite a bit of skepticism, and you'll definitely have some jury members who have some degree of skepticism who will not be very convinced by personal narratives, even though personal narratives might sound good. Another issue is the fundamental attribution error. We tend to misattribute the causes of behavior or the symptoms to internal factors of the person rather than the external situation in which they find themselves. So we tend to incorrectly blame individuals for their distress and overlook situational factors. For example, we attribute distress to personal weakness and ignore external stressors like discrimination. So that's a tendency that I've definitely seen that can be quite problematic, ignoring the kind of distress that accompanies discrimination. Okay, so what do you do to mitigate these cognitive biases? You need to be aware of them. So you're doing the right thing by coming to this webinar. and becoming more aware of these cognitive biases. You need to recognize the presence of these cognitive biases and have training to identify and counteract these biases effectively. You have to have continuous learning, staying updated with the research on these biases, and implement best practices for evaluating the facts of the matter, which includes learning about and addressing these biases. You need to use standardized tools, validated and objective measures, which apply across populations like QALY, so that you can present the case and have it be a fair assessment. And you need to have consistency in your evaluations, and the QALY would provide that. So that's why you really need objective measures, a scientific approach that incorporates clear quantitative metrics that have been verified by research. Something that you can present to any skeptical judge or jury members and who will then accept it because it's been verified and there's a scientific consensus around it. It will ensure reliability across a wide variety of cases. The legal implications is that it will meet the Daubert standard for evaluating expert testimony and will enhance your credibility in court. All right, so that's the what I want to talk to you about the subjective evaluations. And again, if you have any questions about subjective evaluations, please pop them into the chat. All right, no questions so far. Let's go on to part 3, the quality metric. Stands for quality adjusted life year, QALY. You might also hear the term DALY, which is disability adjusted life year, but more commonly, and they're going to be, the research on them is really reasonably similar, but QALY is the more commonly used term, quality adjusted life year. It combines the quantity and quality of life, quantity and quality into one single measure. So quantity, quality, one measure. Calculation of quality. So how do we get to quality? One quality is 1 year of life in perfect health, whatever the health of the person is at their appropriate age and demographic group. So 1 year of life in perfect health, of course, 1 year of life in perfect health for someone who's 20-year-old will be different than 1 year of perfect life for health for someone who's 60 years old, but the appropriate life of perfect health for someone of that age and demographic. 0.5 quality is 1 year of life at 50% quality. So for example, it's typically the typical assessment of blindness is that it takes away half of your quality of life. And so that would be 1 year of life of someone who is blind compared to the same person at the same level of health, except they're not blind. And that would be the difference of 50% less quality of life. What are the components of quality? So length of life, we talked about the length, how long the life is, measured in years lived. So the longevity is highlighted in when you evaluate quality calculations. And then the quality of life, the health-related quality of life measures. Factors influencing quality are physical, mental, and social well-being. And the mental and social well-being are especially relevant for non-economic damages. And of course, physical is as well. And that's often easier to measure. But mental and emotional anguish is what I want to focus on. But of course, the physical one is quite relevant as well. The formula for quality combines both. It's length of life times quality of life. So I take the length of life multiplied by the quality of life. Okay, let's talk about the historical background of quality. Where does it come from? It was developed all the way in the 1960s. So it's a metric that's over 50 years old. So in fact, it's 65-ish years old. So it's it has a great deal of history and a great deal of research behind it. It was initially used to assess the value of specific medical interventions. So for example, if you reverse blindness by curing some parasite, that will give back somebody 50% of their quality back. And so that would be how it was used in the first place. Evolution was that it was adopted by public health and health economists for all sorts of metrics, for metrics of impact of quality of life. And it's increasingly used for policymaking and resource allocation. So standard QALY valuation is 125,000 per QALY in the US as of 2020. I use that metric that year because it's just a simple year to use. It's simple math. Whatever QALY you're using at the time, so when you go to a court case in 2025, which is 5 years later, what you'll want to do is look up the latest numbers on QALY, whatever they are in the US, because they're inflation adjusted. And so you'll want to look up whatever the QALY is. Here, for the sake of this talk, I'm using the 2020 numbers because they make for good, easy, clear math, and I don't have to do fancy math here. The basis for the valuation is that the typical life was valued in 2020 at about 10 million by the US government. The average US life expectancy of about 80 years, so the calculation is 100,000 divided by 80 years is 125,000 per QALY. So you'll see if you go to the current valuation of life, and I can Google right now for current valuation of life by the US government. I think the latest figures I saw, and they're going to be in the Department of Transportation because it's used to evaluate how the infrastructure, various other things. So an example, you can search for the US Department of Transportation value of human life. I think the latest numbers I saw was 13.2 million or something like that. So you want to divide 13.2 million by 80 years and come up with whatever the current value for QALY is. It's going to be somewhat higher, obviously, than the 10 million by 80 years, but I'm using this 125,000 per QALY just for the simple, clear math. So let's take a look at an example study of QALY impact, depression. So if you have a case where somebody has been traumatized by an event and they're experiencing depression. Maybe they've been discriminated against. Maybe they have a car accident. Maybe someone did something mean and nasty to them, whatever it might be. And they're experiencing depression. This is how you would evaluate it. So there's a research done in health quality life outcomes in an article from 2017, pretty recent, called Incremental Decreases in Quality Adjusted Life Years Associated with Higher Levels of Depression Symptoms for US adults age 65 years old and older. So it was done on adults 65 years and older because we have a lot of their information from Medicare. So easy to do math on them. So what was the study? It analyzed data from the CDC on nearly 3,700 adults aged 65 plus from 2005 to 2011 and examined the associations between QALY and depression, measured by the Patient Depression Questionnaire, PHQ-9, which is the standard metric for depression, widely used, highly accepted. Depression score severity categories, just so you know. Non-minimal is 0 for 4. So someone who has 0 for 4 has ranging from no to minimal depression. Mild from 5 to 9. Moderate from 10 to 14, and moderate severe to severe is 15 plus. So moderate severe is 15, and then higher than that is going to be severe. What are the QALY estimates here? The average QALY lived from the start of the study evaluation period for each depression severity category. So again, there are 4 severity categories. Non-minimal, so 0 for 4, was 14 QALYs. Mild, 5 through 9, 7.8 QALYs. So nearly a 50% decrease going from non-minimal to mild. Then moderate, another significant decrease. So going from 7.8 to 4.7. That's going to be moderate from 10 to 14. And then moderate, severe, and severe is going to be another significant decrease, 3.3 QALYs. And so we see that starting from non-minimal, from 14 QALYs, it goes down all the way to 3.3 QALYs. And that's going to be quite a bit of non-economic damages caused by someone experiencing depression. And it qualifies, of course, as emotional distress. So you have a quantification of emotional distress. Major depressive disorder, that's someone who is moderate and above, means 8.35 fewer QALYs. So 65% loss in QALYs. Mild depression, 6.2 fewer QALYs, is a 44% loss in QALYs. And so that pattern was consistent across demographics and comorbidities. So no matter what someone's demographic is, their race, their gender, all social class, whatever, and comorbidities, do they have cancer? Do they have all of these sorts of other symptoms? If they have chronic diseases of various sorts, the pattern was consistent. So, the implications. Every year of major depressive disorder is 125,000 per QALY times 65% of QALY lost is 81,250. And again, this is 2020 numbers, they'll be higher for today. So over 80,000 for each year where an incident has caused someone to experience a major depressive disorder. If some amount event brings about such a disorder, then the cost to the patient experiencing the disorder should be the non-economic damages should be 81,250 per year. Other studies can provide similar assessments of QALY loss. So for other types of mental distress and physical injuries, so whatever the injury is, you can find a study backing up the specific amount of QALY for that situation. Other peer-reviewed studies support the impact of depression on QALY. So there was another study that you can look at. This is in 2000, good study in the Journal of International Psychogeriatrics, which looked at older adults for 4 years, found that the depression is one of the worst medical conditions decreasing quality of life, just below arthritis and heart disease. So arthritis, heart disease, and then depression was the impact on quality of life. So you can use this if something caused someone to experience heart disease or arthritis or cancer or depression. You can use this methodology to evaluate QALY. Let's talk about PHQ-9, that questionnaire and quality assessment. There's some research looking from evidence-based mental health on estimate QALYs using the PHQ-9 scores. So it obtained randomized controlled trials that administered the depression screening tools, PHQ-9, and the QALY screening tool of EQ59-3L. So this is one of the most common tools used to evaluate QALYs, the EQ59-3L screening tool. And it found that depression screening tools like PHQ-9 accurately correspond to EQ59-3L, meaning that depression screening tools correspond to QALY evaluations. So it validates the use of PHQ-9 in assessing QALYs lost due to depression. So peer-reviewed research supports QALY analysis of depression. And that's the kind of knowledge and information you would need in order to present the situation, the case in court. So you can have an expert witness who can talk about these things and present them in court, who can gather this information and present the case. So it provides an objective evidence for legal compensation of non-economic damages for mental and emotional distress, and of course, for physical distress as well. But I'm highlighting emotional distress here because physical distress is much more obvious, right? So I want to highlight in this talk that you can also use QALY for mental and emotional distress, the same in my article, but you can use it for physical distress, very clear. It demonstrates the clinical importance and statistical significance of QALYs. It helps you use QALYs to support claims for physical injury damages, emotional distress damages, and provides an objective measure of mental and emotional harm in a way that otherwise you really couldn't get. So to apply these findings to enhance your case credibility and defensibility. And that's really important for the Daubert standard when you evaluate witnesses. So the definition of the Daubert standard, of course, it's legal precedent for expert witness testimony used by judges to assess the reliability of relevant expert witness testimony. The criteria: testability. You have to have a theory that can be tested. It has to be peer reviewed. There's known or potential error rates that are known and evaluatable. It has to have existing clear standards for the technique and has general acceptance in the academic or other expert community. Quali is great for the standard because it's testable. It's a testable metric in health economics. It has over 60 years of experience in health economics and public health. Peer review, extensively reviewed in scientific literature. You can find literally thousands of studies on qualities. Error rates. Standardized methods minimize error rates in evaluating quality because you have these standardized questionnaires, PHQ-9, and so on, EQ593L. It's established guidelines for quality calculation. It's very important to have those established guidelines. Otherwise, the government wouldn't be using it, it wouldn't be used. And it's widely accepted in health economics. So it passes the Daubert standard with flying colors. So quality is great for quantifiable health outcomes, and expert witnesses can help you get there. It provides a clear framework for emotional distress and physical damages. It's a standardized approach that ensures consistency. It shows rigorous scientific methods and simplifies complex health evaluations, which is really what you want from an expert witness and how you want your case to proceed. Okay. Before I move to some case studies, share if you have any questions. Again, put them into the chat on this part of the talk. And of course, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions at the end. I just wanted to make sure to give you a chance to pop any questions there. All right. No questions. Let's move on to using quality. I'll give you one case study of using quality by plaintiff's attorneys and one case study of using quality by defense attorneys. So I gave some examples of two cases I'm involved in, one for plaintiff's attorneys, one for defense attorneys, but those are ongoing cases. Let me tell you about cases that concluded that I was involved. So Jane Doe was a victim of medical malpractice. She developed major depressive disorder as a result of medical malpractice. Lawsuit, as they unfortunately do, dragged on for 7 years. Expert witness was brought in to assess the impact of emotional distress separately, in addition to direct physical damage from the malpractice. This was separate and in addition. Assessing the impact. The expert witness testified to quality impact of major depressive disorder, which we talked about, that's 65% loss per year. And so that was over 7 years, 4.55 quality lost. And usually it takes about the same time to recover from major depressive disorder as it took to acquire that major depressive disorder. So that's 4.55 plus 4.55. So 4.55 lost plus 4.55 to recover. She was unable to recover, of course, as long as the lawsuit was ongoing because they still have the initial trigger causing the lawsuit, causing the major depressive disorder. So the total quality lost was 4.55 plus 4.55, which is 9.1. And so the requested compensation for emotional distress was 1,137,500, standard value of 125,000 per quality. And so that's 9.1 times 125,000. So 1.137. Eventually, she was awarded 1.1 million just for the emotional distress part, and that's on top of damages awarded for direct physical damage. Now, the case outcome shows how you can use quality to quantify emotional distress and show how it's an objective measure that enhances the credibility in legal cases. It provided a direct, standard, objective metric and strengthened the case for compensation in this situation. It provides defensible evidence in court and demonstrates the effectiveness of scientific methodologies. Okay, so that's used by plaintiff's attorneys. What about defense attorneys? So John Doe, who's an African American employee in a police department, sued the city for discrimination over a 2-year period. So for racial harassment, unfair treatment, led to a diagnosis of, again, major depressive disorder. And so this was documented by medical records and part of a series of similar cases that the city experienced in recent years. He sought 8 million compensation. Previous case payouts ranged from 1 to 5 million, so somewhat higher than previous payouts. And so they wanted a different outcome this time, so they brought in me as an expert witness, and the expert witness quantified the impact using the quality metric. So the expert witness testified again, the depressive disorder results in 65% of quality lost in the more severe cases. Over 2 years, the maximum loss is 1.3 quality. And so depression takes time to manifest, suggesting maybe lower actual loss. But even in the most severe case, it's going to be 1.3 qualities lost. And then again, the recovery time likely to be equal or less to that. So the maximum possible quality lost, including recovery, is 2.6 quality, valued at a total of 325,000. And so the city ended up paying for 250,000. It convinced the jury of reduced quality impact compared to previous payouts, significantly less than previous situations that they had to pay out, 1 to 5 million. The case outcome. Objective analysis for lower compensation. Again, scientifically validated, quantifiable measure of distress. Emphasize the precise impact of discrimination rather than a vague discrimination is bad, which of course it's bad. And that's definitely a problem, but you need to evaluate how bad and give an appropriate compensation. Demonstrates the power of quality in legal evaluations and sets the precedent for precise and objective assessments. It highlights the effectiveness of scientific methodologies in court. Okay, any questions from the case studies? Pop them into the chat. If not, let's talk about how you present quality in court. So you can start by defining quality in its importance. Explain how it combines the quality and quantity of life, and relate quality calculations to the specific situation in the case. As I looked at the two cases, what was the situation in the first case, and what was the situation in the second case? Major depressive disorder in both cases, so we know the standardized quality impact of major depressive disorder, 65%, quality of life lost, and then how long did it last and how long will it take to recover. Use real life examples to illustrate points. Use charts and graphs. I can't emphasize enough the value of charts and graphs. It's not the simplest concept for the jury to appreciate, and some in the jury might not be as math literate as lawyers are. So charts and graphs are very, very helpful for juries, I mean, from my experience with it. Visual comprehension of baseline and impacted quality. Simplify complex health evaluations. Simplify the medical jargon for better understanding by the jury, by the judge, if the judge is the trier of the case. Use layman's terms where possible. Present a clear step-by-step explanation of how you calculated the quality. Walk through the process of how you determine the quality. Highlight the most important findings and ensure the main takeaways are clear and memorable for the trier of the case. Make sure that you have good credibility and authority. Present quality as an objective and quantifiable metric. Contrast with more subjective narrative-based assessments and show how it's consistency. That's a standardized nature of quality. Other people will come to similar conclusions if they assess it because they're using the same standardized methodology. Show consistency across different cases and contexts. Show how it meets the Daubert standard and demonstrates the broad acceptance of quality in health economics and public health and by the US government. Demonstrate the scientific rigor. Reference studies and literature supporting quality. This is especially important when you're talking to the judge for the Daubert standard, but for the jury as well. Highlight the scientific validation of quality. Explain the methodologies that are used in calculating quality and show the reliability and the reproducibility of quality results. For expert testimony, I recommend using expert witnesses to explain the quality methodology, ensure experts can articulate the scientific basis effectively. Again, there are going to be some experts who are going to have medical jargon and who are not going to be able to evaluate and articulate it effectively. So you want to make sure that your expert witness can do so. I think I had a question come in. So the question was, is quality a present value or must the total be discounted for future value? Usually quality is not discounted for future value. So it's already integrated into the quality. each quality life year, or let me say this way, the US government doesn't discount quality for future value. And so that's not something that's done. And so here again, the US government is a good standard to use because it does not discount quality for future value. All right. The benefits of using quality for lawyers. Use quality for cases of emotional distress, like I talked about. Can also use it for physical distress, but emotional distress is harder to evaluate. So I recommend that when you think of emotional distress, non-academic damages in general, great for quality. Physical distress, good as well. It's great as well, but the juries can have a more difficult time evaluating mental and emotional distress, and so quality is especially helpful there. And that's also helpful for physical distress. And it's helpful, of course, especially for physical distress that's not visible, like chronic pains, back injuries, and so on, especially invisible harms, like I said. Hand precise calculations, precise evaluations, provide objective and quantifiable metrics, and increases the defensibility of cases, whether you're a plaintiff's attorney or defense attorney. It improves precision and objectivity. The standardized approach to quantifying distress, very clear, very standardized. It reduces subjectivity in assessments and offers clear and data-driven evidence for you to use. It increases the defensibility of your case because it's a scientifically validated tool. It meets the rigorous Daubert standard and helps strengthen expert testimony. And it helps you serve your clients better because it ensures fair outcomes for them, accurate compensation for emotional distress that's not dependent on narrative and rhetoric skills. It builds stronger evidence-based cases and scientifically validated tools to improve case strengths. It provides comprehensive evaluation of mental anguish and supports higher compensation claims for plaintiffs' attorneys and accurate compensation claims for defense attorneys. So, the key takeaways. You need to understand mental anguish and emotional distress, what it's about. There are some challenges with subjective evaluations that we discussed. That's quite serious. We talked about the quality metric in legal evaluations and why it's beneficial. We took a look at some real world examples. We talked about strategies for how you present quality in court, and especially with expert witnesses who can be helpful, and the benefits for your legal practice. Now, additional resources. Again, if you're watching this as a recording, go to tinyurl.com/DAE event. Again, tinyurl.com/DAE event to get resources. And you'll get a link to slides and a copy of my best-selling book, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. And I'll be happy to give free coaching for integrating these strategies into your work. But if you're here now, I'll get your info from Kim, and then I'll send you the resources. I'll be happy to take any additional questions at this stage.
Hey, folks. So thank you, Dr. Gleb. That was very efficient. And this was never my area of law, and I won't pretend that I could do the math right along with you, but thank you. A very clear presentation. And that may be why you didn't get a lot of questions during that. But we've got about 15 minutes now, folks. And maybe if you have questions, and if it's all right with Dr. Gleb, it might be a little difficult to type them into the chat. You could unmute and just throw them out there. I mean, I'll start. I was wondering, is this something you've done many depositions on as an expert? Is this like you say, it's very well accepted, but I'm just wondering if when in your own work as an expert, if it's something you've gotten questioned by opposing counsel or.
Sure, because it's not well accepted in the legal field. So this is kind of, it's not something that's well known in the legal field. But yes, when it's
Okay.
questioned and you present the evidence for it, yeah, the evidence is highly extensive. But it's something that the legal field does not know much about.
Okay. So that's interesting. For all of you at personal injury or lawyers or insurance defense folks, I'm curious if anybody has any experience with using this metric for determining damages. I mean, I followed along, and it seemed to make some sense, but I'm just wondering if any folks in Vermont have seen this being brought forward in any of the cases you've worked on.
Let's see. So Zachary messaged me, uh, are there any government agencies or programs that reject using Quali? No, all government agencies and programs use Quali quite extensively. So this is the standardized metrics that they use in evaluating things. So again, this is why it's very easy to get judges to accept it for a Daubert standard. Not only is it widely accepted in the scientific community, but it's the standard standardized used by the US government. Nothing, no one rejects using quality.
And you got that question about whether it looks forward. Um, is there is there a way to use it to, when you get to the lawsuit, I mean, presumably somebody's at a medical endpoint, but emotional suffering may continue for however long. How is there a way to quantify that with using this or?
So you want to see what kind of suffering it is and then see how long it's going to go on for. And so that's going to be the use of quality. And each type of suffering, like PTSD, for example, if I remember in the current case, so PTSD has, so you have the major depressive disorder, that's a decrease of quantity of life by 65%. For PTSD, there's a decrease in quality of life by 34%. And so it depends whatever the case is and whatever the impact is, and for how long it would be.
Okay, so another question did just pop there in the chat. I don't know if you can see that from Barry.
Are the objective questionnaire metrics you reference used by psychologists and mental health counselors other than reaching quality? Yes. So PHQ-9 and so on are used by just to measure the major depressive disorder. And they can also be used to see, okay, if someone has a major depressive disorder separately, how much does that impact their quality of life? But yes, it's used for all sorts of purposes. Then Alan messaged me, does the age of the party affect the calculation of how many qualities are lost? Yeah, absolutely. So quality would be lost for the 20-year-old versus the 80-year-old. Yes. So if you're looking at the quality lost, you're looking at the rest of your life. So if you have a permanent injury, then you'll see that a 20-year-old with the they will have something like 60 years of expected life versus someone who is 80-year-old, which you'll have to look at what the expectation of life is for someone who is 80 years old. There's only going to be several years of expected life. So that's going to be a much shorter permanent injury. And so, yeah, John, I'll give you my email in the chat. So John asked for how to reach me, and you just email me at gleb@disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Let's see, hold on. So you have Thomas asked for give examples of how quality is used by the federal government. I'll just share my screen here for the US Department of Transportation, department guidance in the valuation of a statistical life in economic analysis. And so you'll see departmental guidelines on valuing the reduction of fatalities and injuries by regulations or investments has been published periodically. And so each year since 1993. So they've been using this for a long time, for over 3 decades. And what they're looking at is, so what they're looking at is how much each life is going to be worth. And it's going to be, as you see, inflation adjusted over time. I was using a life from 2020, well, a little bit earlier because just I want to use a 10 million for easy math. So the current life year is 2023. They were using this. It hasn't been updated since then. So the current usage is going to be 13.2 million. And what they use it for is to evaluate whether if you want to build in some safeguards on the road, some concrete blocks, how many average lives statistically will you save? And so then if you need to, if you have, if it will save more lives than it will cost to build the road in a certain way or a bridge in a certain way that's more safe, then they will use that. And so that's the way that the Department of Transportation uses it. And all other sorts of regulations will use it that way. Okay, John asked to repeat my contact info a bit more slowly. Sure. Gleb, Gleb, and I'll put it into the chat as well. Gleb at disaster, Disaster, avoidance, Avoidance, experts, experts.com. And John, I also put my email into the chat. Does the same Bill Lee asks, does the same calculation regarding age apply to plaintiffs with terminal conditions? So it depends on how long the condition is. And if you have a condition that's expected for someone to die within 10 years, that's going to be whatever the quality is. And so if you have a situation where someone was going to have a life of 80 years and then had developed a terminal condition that's attributable to some event that caused their life to be shortened to 3 years, then you'll have the difference between the rest of their life and the 3 years, whatever it might be. And so that would be how you'd calculate quality in that regard. Uh, Zachary, great question of anyone comparing data looking at versus juries versus similar cases. I've not heard that evidence. Not that I'm aware of in terms of compiling the data, but I think that would be a great study. So yeah, well, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, don't be shy. I've got a couple more minutes here if you've got questions. Um, it seems to me this would be something you've talked a lot about juries and judges, but settlement discussions would likely ensue, I would think, after this evidence is mustered. I don't know if you have any experience
Oh
with
yeah,
that.
yeah. Most situations I do an expert witness report, and it results in a settlement. So that's usually what I tend to see, settlements rather than the final trial. But sometimes it goes to trial, so it just depends on the situation. But yes, mostly I see settlements. Thomas, I'm not sure is the use of quality across the US. I've done cases in California, Pennsylvania. I've done now in Maryland and Texas. So I've done cases in those states. And obviously, as you can hear, that's pretty widespread across the US, but don't know about the rest of the states.
Were any of those jury trials, or I mean, were
Yeah.
you yeah. Mhm.
Mhm.
And the evidence came in as expected, and yeah, okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, folks, so got a couple more minutes. If you got any more questions, we maybe we'll get Dr. Gleb back sometime, but we've got him right now, so
Mhm. Let's see.
have some.
Adam messaged me of whether quali allow for adjustment based upon the unique characteristics of a particular plaintiff. So that's the nice thing about quali, that it's standardized. And so that's going to be more fair in terms of approaching the situation. And you will have plaintiffs from whom, so you don't have to rely on the individual personal narrative and story of each plaintiff, but you have, plaintiffs who are experiencing PTSD, and here's the average quality. plaintiffs who are experiencing major depressive disorder, plaintiffs who are experiencing chronic pain. And so you have quite clear research-based evidence across relevant demographics. So that standardized approach is very useful for juries and judges to not try to dig out the weeds of each individual person and their individual circumstances that say, okay, on average, this is what happens. So that fair standard across cases would be this type of outcome.
Anybody else? Got about 5 minutes. Um, is there anything else that you wanted to share with us, Dr. Gleb? I know you got through all your slides and everything, so
I'm happy with what I shared. So it's just
okay.
really important, I think, for a standardized scientific approach, kind of where you're looking at demographics, and that creates a lot of fairness and standardization. And that is going to be quite convincing to juries and judges when science is about standardization. It's about really looking at, okay, across demographics, across populations, what's going to be the appropriate, fair, average impact on the quality of life of any sort of whatever negative events that we're talking about, personal injuries or well, that's or discrimination. How does this discrimination impact quality of life on average? So that is quite valuable, what I think about. Okay, couple of questions. John asked about copies of the slides. Yes, so Kim will send me information on the attendees, and I'll send everyone copies of the slides. Barry asks, what tactics have been used against my approach by the other side? Mainly, it's been focusing on personal narratives. So focusing on personal narratives, focusing on rhetoric, and kind of appealing to personal stories, which again is not something that's not going to be very appealing to anyone who wants a standardized, fair approach, which of course is the basis of jurisprudence, standardization and fairness. Oh, judges include any special instructions to juries who have heard quality evidence? Not that I have not heard, I have not observed any such special instructions.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Gleb. We're doing a CLE tomorrow on cybersecurity. I hope a lot of you will come back for that. More experts um, who have contributed to our Vermont Bar Journal. We're happy to have them tomorrow. And of course, save the date, March 28th. We're going to be down in Manchester for our big mid-year meeting. That's going to be really interesting, given all the things that are going on in the country right now. We have a lot to talk about there. So, folks, thank you for coming today. Thank you again, Dr. Gleb. He will be following up. We'll get your contact information to him. And that was very interesting. And getting thank you from Joanna and from Jay Scott. Thank you. Thanks for your kind words. And thanks, everybody, for being here. We'll see you at the next CLE. And thank you again, Dr. Gleb.
Thank you all.
And
Have
you're
a
our
great
host,
day.
so you're going to have to close the meeting.
Sure, happy to.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you, everybody. Bye now.
Bye-bye.